Ever get like totally invested in a fictional character story? You know, you're rooting for them or you're like super bummed when something bad happens.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like when a favorite character bites the dust, gets you right in the feels.
Right. It's a pretty common thing, getting emotionally hooked by these stories. But when you actually stop and think about it, it's kind of strange, isn't it?
It is kind of weird, yeah. I mean, these are made-up people, not real folks walking around.
Exactly. They're not real, but we still end up having these, well, real feelings about them. And that's what we're going to dig into today.
A deep dive into feelings for fictional folks. Sounds intriguing.
It's a fascinating puzzle. Like, what's actually happening in our brains when we have such strong reactions to something we know deep down isn't really happening?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Luckily, we have a fantastic resource to help us figure this out.
Well, what's that?
The Emotional Responses to Fiction entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Ah, the good old SEPI.
Mm-hmm.
Always a solid source.
It's a great overview of all the different philosophical angles on this. It's like a shortcut to understanding this very human and maybe a little strange thing we all do.
I'm all for shortcuts when it comes to philosophy.
Mm.
Sometimes those articles can be, well, a bit dense.
Totally. So yeah, our mission today is to unpack this thing called the paradox of fiction.
Paradox of fiction, huh? That sounds pretty serious.
It is a bit of a head scratcher. It's this question. How is it possible for us to have genuine emotional responses to stuff we know isn't real?
Like our brains know it's fake, but our hearts are like, nope, this is serious business.
Exactly. We're going to explore how different philosophers try to explain this. We'll look at their ideas about what emotions really are and how we get so deeply involved in these fictional worlds. Ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Let's unravel this paradox.
All right, let's go. So one of the things that really points to how strange this whole thing is this thing called the asymmetry problem.
Asymmetry problem. Okay, I'm listening.
Basically, it's the fact that even though we can have strong feelings for fictional characters, the way we react in the real world is totally different than if those same things happen to, real people in our lives.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Like, take, for example, Mercutio's death in Romeo and Juliet.
Okay, yeah, classic Shakespearean tragedy.
You might feel a genuine pang of sadness, maybe even tear up a bit, but you're not going to, jump out of your seat and demand justice for Mercutio, right?
No, not really. I'd probably just, keep watching the play.
Right, and you're definitely not going to be, uncontrollably sobbing in the aisle, right?
Unless I was a really, really dedicated method actor, maybe.
Yeah, true. But the point is, you're still sitting there watching the play, you feel the emotion, but it doesn't lead you to do the kinds of things that a real-life tragedy would.
So there's this disconnect between our feelings and our actions when it comes to fiction.
That's the asymmetry. And this difference in how we actually behave is a big clue for philosophers trying to figure this out. It's like a key piece of the puzzle. And it leads us to one major philosophical idea called the distinct attitude view, or DAV for short.
DAV, got it. So what's the gist of this view?
Well, the core idea is that when we're dealing with fiction, we engage with it using a totally different mental approach than when we're processing real-life stuff.
So it's like our brains have a fiction mode.
That's one way to put it. Some theories within DAV suggest it's like we've got this separate mental space, almost like a sandbox, where we can mess around with stuff that's not real, like fictional scenarios and characters. It's like our regular mental processes are still running, but they're contained. They're not fully connected to our real world responses.
Interesting. Like the software's working, but the hardware's offline.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. Like you can feel a thrill watching a super intense car chase in a movie, right?
Oh, yeah, cool.
But you don't suddenly have the urge to floor it in your own car on the way home.
No, definitely not. That'd be reckless.
Right. So the feeling is there, but it doesn't automatically flip that switch to real-world action.
It's contained, like you said.
Another way philosophers talk about it is offline processing. We might be using the same mental tools we use in real life to make sense of what's going on in a story, but the output is totally different.
Makes sense. So we're understanding the story, but not reacting to it as if it were real.
And this leads to what some call pretend, simulated, or even imaginary beliefs, desires, and emotions.
So they're not quite real, but they feel real.
Yeah, they might feel very real internally, but they don't have the same impact on our real-world actions.
Interesting. It's like our brains are running a simulation.
And that's actually how some philosophers explain it. Guys like Curry and Ravenscroft talk about these things called imaginary mental states, and they say these states operate offline, just like we were talking about.
Okay, so walk me through that. How do these imaginary mental states work?
Well, they argue that in our everyday lives, our beliefs and emotions are directly tied to the things we do. Like our beliefs motivate our actions and our emotions, well, they influence our behavior, right?
Yeah, I can see that. Like if I believe it's going to rain, I'll grab an umbrella. And if I'm feeling sad, I might not feel like going out.
Exactly. But when we're immersed in fiction, these imaginary states don't necessarily translate into real world behaviors. It's almost like our brain is doing a practice run, trying out these feelings and thoughts in a safe space.
Like a mental rehearsal.
Exactly. And it's interesting because it makes me think about how kids play pretend. Have you ever noticed how kids can get so into their made-up scenarios? Like they'll genuinely get upset if their pretend friend does something mean, right?
Yeah, they'll be like full on sobbing over a broken toy teacup or something.
But then they snap out of it pretty quickly and go back to playing. It seems like as adults, we kind of develop this more sophisticated ability to experience these really strong emotions while engaging with fiction, but without having a full-blown meltdown in real life.
Yeah, we learn to compartmentalize those feelings, to keep the fictional emotions separate from our real-world reactions.
Right. So we're getting better at using this offline processing mode. We can engage our imaginations, feel all these intense emotions, but it all stays within that safe space of the story.
Makes sense. It's like we're building up their emotional resilience through fiction.
Maybe so. Now, another big theory that tries to explain all this is the theory of make-believe. Have you heard of that one?
Oh yeah, make-believe. That's the one where engaging with a story is like playing a big game of pretend,
You
right?
got it. And the philosopher who's really known for championing this idea is Kendall Walton. So how does this idea of make-believe help explain our emotional responses?
All ears.
Well, Walton argues that when we engage with fiction, it's essentially like we're all agreeing to play a game of pretend together. The story sets up the rules and creates this fictional world, and within that world, whatever the story says is true, well, it's fictionally true.
Okay, so it's all about creating this separate reality. Like those kids building a blanket fort, they know it's not a real castle, but in their game, it is.
Exactly. So when I'm reading, say, a fantasy novel, I'm kind of buying into this world the author created, and all my emotional reactions are part of that game.
So it's not that we actually believe dragons and magic are real, it's that we're pretending to believe for the sake of the story.
Exactly. We're pretending to believe that the hero is in danger, and all those feelings we have, the fear, the hope, they're all part of that game.
And that makes sense because it ties back to the asymmetry problem, right?
Right. If my worry for the hero is just part of this make-believe game, then it stays within that imaginative realm, and it doesn't necessarily have to make me do anything in real life. Like, I don't have to call up the author and be like, hey, watch out, the dragon's gonna get you.
Yeah, no need for that. So make-believe helps explain why our emotional responses to fiction stay contained within that fictional world.
Exactly. Now, here's where it gets a bit more nuanced. Another philosopher, Stacey Friend, she points out that Walton isn't saying that we have zero genuine emotions when we're engaging with fiction.
Oh, interesting. So there's room for both real and make-believe emotions.
Right. What Walton is saying is that the core emotions tied to this make-believe game, like the fear, the joy, the sadness we feel for those characters, they're a different kind of emotion.
So not fake emotions, but a different category altogether.
Yeah, and Friend describes them as being functionally and cognitively quarantined from our everyday emotions.
Quarantined, huh? So they're like in a separate emotional compartment.
Exactly. They're running on a different track. They can be intense, but they don't spill over and affect our real-world behavior in the same way.
Fascinating. It's like our brains are capable of running these parallel emotional systems, one for real life and one for fiction.
It seems that way. Now, make-believe theory also touches on a really fundamental question that philosophers love to debate. And that question is, do fictional entities actually exist? Like, do these characters have some kind of real being, even though they're not flesh and blood?
Oh, that's a big one. Existence of fictional beings. Gets pretty metaphysical.
Yeah, it gets into some pretty deep philosophical waters. But Walton's view on this is pretty clear-cut. He says that, strictly speaking, they don't exist outside of our make-believe game.
Okay, so no special realm for fictional characters.
Right. When we talk about them, it's like we're making these pretend statements about these pretend objects.
So we're not talking about them as if they're real things. We're just playing along with the game.
Exactly. And this is a big contrast to those theories out there that suggest fictional characters actually have some sort of abstract existence, like they exist in some alternate dimension or something. But the make-believe view keeps it grounded in our imagination. It's not that they exist out there somewhere, it's that we create them in our minds.
It's like we're the authors of their existence, at least within the context of the story.
Yeah, in a way, we're bringing them to life through our engagement with the fiction. And this idea that fictional stuff isn't real in the usual sense, it often goes hand in hand with another theory we touched on earlier, simulation theory.
Oh, right, simulation theory. The one where we're mentally putting ourselves in the character's shoes.
That's the one. So how does simulation theory help us understand those emotional responses?
Well, it suggests that we understand a fictional character's thoughts and feelings, their whole inner world, by using our own minds as a kind of simulator. It's like we're mentally putting ourselves in their position and then trying to imagine how we would feel.
It's like a mental test drive of their experience.
Exactly. We're trying to get inside their heads, see the world through their eyes, and feel what they're feeling.
And then we take those feelings we've simulated and we kind of project them back onto the character, right?
Yep. That's how we make sense of their actions and reactions. We're using our own emotional repertoire to fill in the gaps.
And one philosopher, Alvin Goldman, he talked about something called an active imagining, or e-imagining for short. Basically, it's the idea that we sort of imaginatively transform ourselves into the character. We try to adopt their beliefs and desires, and then we pay attention to what we feel in that moment.
So it's not just about understanding what the character is feeling, it's about trying to actually feel it ourselves.
Exactly. It's about experiencing their emotional world firsthand through this simulation.
That makes sense. It explains why we get so invested in characters. We're not just observing them, we're kind of living through them.
And then there's another philosopher, Gregory Curry, who also has a version of this. He focuses on how we simulate both fictional actions and the characters' minds.
Okay, so we're not just simulating emotions, we're simulating their whole thought process.
Right, and he makes this distinction between primary imagining, which is about understanding what the story presents as true, like accepting the rules of that fictional world, and secondary imagining, which is more about that empathetic act of really trying to relive a character's experience.
So if the story says a wizard casts a spell, primary imagining is accepting that as part of that world. Secondary imagining is trying to feel what it's like to be that wizard or maybe someone witnessing that spell.
That's a great example. And both Walton, with his make-believe theory, and these proponents of simulation theory within the DAV, they all suggest that these imaginative processes are kind of stand-ins for genuine beliefs and emotions. We're having imaginative or fictional versions of these things, not the real deal. And that helps explain why we treat fictional characters differently than real people, because ultimately we don't believe they exist in the same way.
Right. Our relationship with them is based on imagination, not actual belief.
Exactly. Now, so far we've been looking at this through the lens of a distinct mental attitude. We've talked about make-believe and we've delved into simulation theory. But the Stanford entry also brings up another key player in all of this: empathy.
Empathy. The ability to understand and share the feelings of others. How does that fit into the puzzle?
Well, some philosophers think empathy might be the main driver of our emotional connection to fictional characters. Just like with simulation, it involves putting yourself in the character's shoes and trying to grasp their emotions.
So instead of just running a cold simulation, we're actually tapping into our capacity for empathy to connect with them emotionally.
Exactly. And it's not just one thing either. There are different levels or types of empathy. Some are more automatic, happening without us even realizing it.
Like instinctively cringing when you see a character get hurt on screen, even though you know it's not real.
Exactly. And that actually relates to one of the types of empathy that Martin Hoffman describes: mimicry. It's like our brains are wired to mirror other people's emotions. There's also this thing called direct association, where a character's situation might trigger memories of our own past experiences, and those memories bring up certain feelings.
So we're not just understanding the character's emotions, we're experiencing our own emotions that are triggered by their situation.
Right. And these can happen super fast without us even thinking about it. But then there's also a more conscious, deliberate form of empathy called perspective taking.
Perspective taking. That sounds like it requires more effort.
It does. It's where we really make an effort to understand the character's point of view, why they're doing what they're doing, and how they're feeling. And all these different forms of empathy, they work together to create that powerful emotional connection we feel toward fictional characters.
So empathy is like a multifaceted tool that allows us to build relationships with these imaginary beings.
That's a great way to put it. Now, all these theories we've talked about so far, they're all trying to explain the mechanics of how we respond emotionally to fiction. But the Stanford entry also mentions that some philosophers aren't totally on board with these explanations. They think there might be more to it.
Oh, interesting. So what are their counterarguments?
Well, some argue that maybe we don't always need to simulate or pretend in order to understand and feel for characters. Noel Carroll, for instance, he points out that a lot of times authors make a character's inner life super obvious through their actions, the dialogue, and even just the way the story is written. We can often just see that a character is grieving, for example, without having to go through the whole process of simulating grief ourselves.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes the storytelling is so direct, it just hits you right in the gut.
Exactly. And then there's another point that's often raised against these dominant theories. Remember how the distinct attitude view relies on this idea of functionalism?
Yeah, functionalism. The idea that mental states are defined by what they do, their inputs and outputs.
Right. So the argument is that since our reactions to fiction are so different behaviorally from how we respond in real life, those underlying mental states must also be different. Like, we don't run out and try to save the day when a fictional character is in trouble, so the feeling of concern we have can't be the same as the concern we'd feel for a real person in danger.
Right, because the function of the emotion is different. It doesn't lead to the same kind of action. Like that car analogy we were using before, it's the function of getting you from point A to point B that makes it a car, not necessarily the specific parts it's made of. So with fictional emotions, it's the lack of real-world action that makes them distinct.
Exactly. But here's the thing, not everyone's on board with a purely functionalist view of the mind. Some philosophers argue that mental states might not be solely defined by what they do. Maybe there's more to it than that. And if that's the case, then it could be that we are actually having standard, genuine emotional responses to fiction, even if we don't act on them in the same way.
So the feelings themselves could be the same, but the context is different, which changes how we act on them.
That's the idea. And then there's another big issue that comes up, something called the phenomenological worry. And this is all about how our emotional responses to fiction actually feel.
Phenomenological worry. That sounds deep.
It is. It's about that subjective experience of emotion. And when we feel those emotions in response to fiction, they feel real, they feel automatic. It doesn't feel like we're consciously choosing to pretend or run a mental simulation.
Right. Yeah, exactly. When I'm really engrossed in a story and I feel that heartbreak for a character, it's not like I'm thinking, okay, brain, activate the pretend sadness module. It just happens.
Right. It feels like a natural, spontaneous response. Now, proponents of the DAV, they might say, well, maybe that make-believe or that simulation process, it's just become so ingrained, so automatic, that it's happening below our conscious awareness. But some philosophers, especially more recently, they're really starting to question this whole idea that there's this clear-cut distinction between our emotions about fiction and our emotions about real life. One philosopher in particular, Stacy Friend, she argues that those lines are way more blurry than we might think.
So maybe the emotions aren't so different after all.
That's what she's suggesting. She says that in terms of how they function, what motivates them, and just how they feel, our emotions about fiction and real life are way more interconnected than we might realize. Like, think about the intensity of sadness someone might feel over a fictional character's death. It can be just as powerful as grief over a real loss.
Yeah, you can be absolutely devastated even though you know it's not a real person.
And that suggests that maybe it's not a totally different kind of emotion after all.
It really makes you question those neat categories we try to put emotions into.
It does. So you see, we keep coming back to the heart of this whole thing, this paradox of fiction. On the one hand, we have these emotions that feel totally real, but on the other hand, we know those objects of our emotions, those fictional characters and events, they're not real. And the traditional view is that genuine emotions require us to actually believe that the thing we're reacting to exists. It's a philosophical knot that's hard to untangle.
It is a tough one. So how do philosophers even begin to approach this paradox?
Well, they've come up with a few different strategies. One way is to just accept that maybe our emotional responses to fiction are a little bit irrational. Another way is to try and challenge one of those core ideas that make up the paradox itself.
Okay, let's break those down. First, the irrationality angle. How does that work?
Well, one of the philosophers who really put this paradox on the map, Colin Radford, he seemed to think that our emotions towards fiction involve a kind of inconsistency. Like, We're simultaneously believing and not believing in the reality of the fiction.
It's like our brains are trying to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time.
Exactly. And that tension, that's where the irrationality comes in. Another philosopher, Taroni, he interprets Radford's view as basically saying that our emotions about fiction just don't make sense. Like they should just disappear the moment we remember it's all made up.
Because if we know it's not real, why are we still having these intense feelings?
Right. But Radford himself, he kind of pushed back on that. He pointed out that we have all sorts of reactions that might seem incoherent from a purely logical standpoint. Like people get so passionate about sports, they'll cheer, they'll cry, they'll get into huge arguments, but their actions don't actually have any impact on the game.
Yeah, true. It's like our emotions don't always follow the rules of logic. Yeah.
Exactly. And he also brought up the fear of death. Even when we're not consciously thinking about it, there's this underlying fear. But logically, if we don't believe in any kind of afterlife, then what are we even afraid of?
That's a good point. It seems like there's a gap between our emotional lives and our rational understanding of the world.
There is. And philosophers have actually spent a lot of time trying to figure out the whole rationality of emotions thing. Like, are they even supposed to be rational? They've come up with different criteria for judging the rationality of an emotion. Like,
Yeah.
is it correct? Does the object of the emotion actually exist? Does the emotion fit? Do we have good reason to be feeling it? And is it proper? Is it appropriate in the context?
So even outside of fiction, the relationship between emotions and rationality is complex.
It is. And Taroni, he specifically addresses this with fiction. He says that emotions about fiction can be considered correct if the fictional world itself gives us enough justification for feeling that way.
So feeling scared during a horror movie is correct because the movie is designed to evoke fear.
Yeah, within the context of that fictional world, it makes sense. But another philosopher, Curry, he points out that this whole thing about epistemic emotional rationality, meaning having emotions that are based on knowledge, well, it gets really tricky with fiction because fiction often gives us information that we know is false. Like if you see a character get bitten by a vampire in a movie, you might feel scared, even though you know vampires aren't real.
Right. Our emotions are responding to the fictional truth, not necessarily the actual truth.
Exactly. So some philosophers say, okay, maybe these responses aren't perfectly rational, but that's just how our brains work. But then there are others who try to tackle the first part of the paradox head on, that we have genuine emotions about fiction. And to be honest, that feels kind of wrong to me. Like, those feelings can be so powerful, how can they not be genuine?
Yeah, it's hard to dismiss them as just fake emotions. So how do those philosophers explain it?
Well, this is where Walton's idea of imaginary or make-believe emotions comes back into play. He's saying that, yeah, they might feel very similar to real emotions, but they're missing this key ingredient, which is the belief that the object of our emotion actually exists. And because of that, he says they don't qualify as truly genuine.
So it's like they're missing that grounding in reality that makes an emotion truly genuine.
That's his argument. But as we've said, the feelings themselves, they feel so real. Like the goosebumps you get during a suspenseful scene or that lump in your throat when something sad happens. Walton tries to address that by suggesting those might be quasi-emotions. They've got those physical sensations, but they don't have the full cognitive weight of a genuine emotion.
So it's like the body's reacting, but the mind knows it's not a real threat or a real loss.
Right. And he uses this example. He says, imagine you hear that a close friend has died. You'd be devastated, right? But then you find out it was just a prank. Someone was messing with you. And that feeling of sorrow, it would probably vanish pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, it would be a huge relief, and the sadness would disappear.
And belief-based theories, they say this is exactly what happens with genuine emotions. They're tied to that belief in the object, and when the belief is gone, the emotion goes away too.
So my fear of a movie villain isn't true fear, because I know deep down that they can't actually hurt me.
Exactly. Now, another strategy is to go after the second part of the paradox, that we don't believe fictional characters exist, which, to be honest, seems like a pretty hard case to make.
Yeah, not many people would argue that they genuinely believe Harry Potter is walking around somewhere.
Exactly. Very few philosophers would say we actually believe fiction is real while we're engaged with it. But there is this famous idea from the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge called suspension of disbelief.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. The idea that we kind of willingly ignore our knowledge that it's not real so we can fully immerse ourselves in the story.
Right. And some philosophers, they've taken that idea and run with it. They've developed what's called illusion theory, which suggests that we might actually experience some real illusions while we're engaging with fiction.
Illusions, like seeing things that aren't there.
Not necessarily. There's the cognitive illusion, which is the idea that we might momentarily believe, like really believe, that fictional events are actually happening. And then there's the perceptual illusion, where we might briefly perceive fictional objects as if they were really there in front of us. One philosopher, Carroll, he's laid out these ideas in detail.
So it's like our brains are temporarily tricked into believing the fiction is real.
That's the idea. But these theories, they run into some problems. Remember the asymmetry problem we were talking about? If we truly believe the fiction, why wouldn't we act like it? Like, why wouldn't we try to warn a character about danger or call the police if we see a fictional crime happening?
Yeah, that's a good point. Our behavior doesn't really match up with the idea that we're fully believing in the fiction.
And on top of that, our own conscious experience usually contradicts this idea of a cognitive illusion. We know it's not real, even when we're caught up in the story.
It's like a part of our brain is always reminding us, this is just a story.
Exactly. Carroll himself, he actually rejects the idea of a perceptual illusion, at least when it comes to visual media, like movies and TV. He says that because we're always aware of the screen, the stage, the medium itself, it's a constant reminder that what we're seeing is just a representation, not reality.
It's like that frame around a painting, reminding you it's a work of art, not a window into the real world.
Great analogy. But then there's another philosopher, Kulti Dunn, who offers a bit more nuanced take on this. He argues that even though we know it's not real, we might still form these very immediate perception-based beliefs about fictional entities. And those beliefs, they might clash with our more reasoned understanding that it's all made up.
So it's like our immediate sensory experience is telling us one thing, but our higher level thinking is telling us something else.
Exactly. And that conflict, that's where the illusion lies. Okay, so we've looked at the approaches that focus on irrationality and those that try to challenge the first two propositions of the paradox. But there's one more strategy, and that's to go after the third proposition. The idea that genuine emotions absolutely require belief in the object's existence.
So basically arguing that belief isn't a necessary ingredient for emotion, that's a bold move.
It is. And there are a few different ways philosophers have tried to make this case. Some cognitivist theories suggest that maybe emotions are actually made up of thoughts or judgments, and those thoughts, they don't necessarily require a belief in the object's actual existence.
So the feeling of terror I get watching a monster movie, it might just be coming from the thought of a monster, not from actually believing there's a monster lurking in my closet.
Exactly. And you can even have those shivery feelings just thinking about a scary story you read,
Exactly.
right? Even though it's just words on a page.
Yeah, you can still get those chills. So maybe it's the thoughts, not the belief, that are driving the emotion.
That's one possibility. And then there are these other theories called non-cognitive theories. They argue that emotions are actually more about conscious feelings, bodily changes, or our awareness of those changes. And from this perspective, the realness of the object, it just doesn't matter.
So if the feeling of fear is real, then the emotion of fear is real, regardless of whether there's an actual threat or not.
That's the idea. It's all about the internal experience, not the external reality. And this ties back to that phenomenological worry we were talking about earlier, that whole subjective feel of emotions. If it feels like a real emotion, maybe it is a real emotion, regardless of what we believe about the object.
It's like our bodies are reacting, our minds are experiencing the feeling, so why wouldn't it be a genuine emotion?
That's a valid question. And to be fair, while most people would say that emotions are all about those feelings, philosophers tend to think it's a bit more complicated than that. The general consensus is that emotions involve some kind of evaluation. Like we're having an emotional response because something has significance for us, right?
So we're not just feeling, we're also making some kind of judgment about the situation.
Exactly. So then the question becomes, can we actually have the right kind of evaluative relationship with these fictional objects to have genuine emotions about them? Like, can we really care about something we know doesn't exist?
That's a tricky one. But then again, we do seem to care about fictional characters. We get invested in their stories. We want